Going through emotions that keeping my eyes open. The tides may rise upon my ocean. Will you be there, there, there? Say you will, say you will, say you'll be there, my love. Just say you'll be there. Say you will, say you will, say you'll be there, my love. Say you will, say you will, say you'll be there, my love. Just say you'll be there. Say you will, say you will, say you'll be there, my love. Every day is a lonesome free fall, more or less. Battle royale of lost intention. Battle royale of lost intention. More than a friend to me, tag team partner of my dreams. Please don't let me down. Turn on me, count me out. Love has come and gone. In and out of unsafe fun. Yeah, sex from you, no harm. Say you'll be there, swear, swear. Say you will, say you will, say you'll be there, my love. Just say you'll be there. Say you will, say you will, say you'll be there, my love. Just say you'll be there. Say you will, say you will, say you'll be there, my love. I'll be there. Say you will, say you will, say you'll be there, my love. I need you. Say you swear you'll be there.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad you're here, taking the time out of your day to talk about movement building for Black futures. I'm Geraldine Roberts, and I am the Leadership Development Director here at the African American Leadership Forum, and it's an honor to hold this space with you. So, again, this is the movement building for Black futures. It's time we've set aside to think together, to practice together, and to grow together. We created this series to imaginatively gather the people already shaping Black futures across neighborhoods, workplaces, and creative spaces. At the African American Leadership Forum, we move as a think and do tank, guided by Black-centered design and Afrofuturism, because we believe the solutions we need live within our communities. Our mission is simple and it's bold: to create radical Black futures in Minnesota where opportunity and justice are lived, not just promised. That's the horizon we're moving together today. So, in our first session, Amber Jones laid the foundation of the series in her session titled Power is Plural: The Foundations of Movement Building. Then last week, our Chief Narrative Officer and Interim CEO, Dara Beavis, explored narrative justice in her session titled The Story is the Strategy: Narrative Justice in Action. Both Amber and Dara's sessions are up on our YouTube page if you missed them or if you just need a refresher and want to rewatch them. And so, over the remaining Thursdays, today and next Thursday in this series, we're going to explore more core elements of the movement like sustainability and care. So, our strategies reflect our values, and our leadership is grounded in care. This hour is for alignment, is for clarity and practice. So, a quick few notes before we begin. We're here to learn in public. So, curiosity is welcome. You will see a Q&A section that you can ask questions, and you can also put questions in the chat. You can also use the chat to uplift insights and share resources. I do ask that you be respectful, and we ask that you keep the conversation in the chat focused on our topics today. So today's session is called Impact as Practice, the Sustaining the Movement with Wintana Melakim. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. So Wintana is the founder and executive director of Groundwork Institute, a statewide civic engagement organization dedicated to building the next generation of leaders in Minnesota. With more than a decade of experience leading transformative campaigns and organizations, Wintana has been at the forefront of efforts that have reshaped the state's civic and political landscape. Her work is contributed to the election of leaders at every level of government, from school board, um, sorry, I lost my place. Sorry about that. Okay. So her from school board to Congress, excuse me, and majority policy victories, including raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour in the Twin Cities, passing paid sick time, restoring voting rights for more than 55,000 Minnesotans, and ending prison gerrymandering. Through Groundwork Institute, Wintana is advancing her vision of the statewide hub where leaders are trained, they're supported, and they're resourced. The Institute equips organizers and community members with the skills, strategy, and connections they need to strengthen democracy and build a more just Minnesota. We are so excited and grateful to be learning from her today. Okay, so let's take a collective breath together as we arrive here. We're focused here to learn from Wintana. All right, Wintana, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you for that amazing introduction. What folks don't know is that the two of us have actually known each other since we were kids. We're Central grads, St. Paul Central. So very happy to be here with my longtime friend. So as she shared, my name is Wintana Melakeen, and I work at an organization called Groundwork. So before I kick us off today, I'm going to talk a little bit about Groundwork and how we came together. Last year, after working on many campaigns, the last one being the Harris campaign, I learned a lot about what was going on in the Minnesota political organizer ecosystem. And so I started to vision, what solutions can I bring? What can I add? What is missing? And the thing that I realized is that lots of folks had desires and wants to participate in whether it was electoral or community organizing or government, bureaucracy, whatever way they wanted to participate, but didn't have an entryway or an understanding of how things worked. And so I started to vision in February of this year, and in August, we launched Groundwork Institute, which is our 501c3. It's just a legal way to say nonpartisan organization. And then we have a 501c4, which is just a legal way to say a political arm that is called Groundwork Action, which helps us work directly with folks who are working to pass agendas. And so that is a little bit about Groundwork, what we do, who we serve. If you are ever interested in a training, you can always just reach out and make a request. We train all across the state of Minnesota with organizations, with individuals. We do everything from coaching to large scale 200 plus sessions. I will then go on to the next slide. Awesome. So who am I? I am an organizer. So being in this new role as this ED, I always have folks who call me like ED or CEO or advisor. At my core, I am a community organizer. That is like how I identify. That's what I believe. That's what I am at the very center of me. Before any election work, before any other title, the thing that's most important to me is that I organize around issues that matter to my community. And the community that I organize in is centering working class Black community and making sure that we are able to have all the access that we need, and we're able to meet all the essential essentials for life, but also be able to reach our wildest dreams. That is the motivator for every and anything that I do. And then we'll go to the next slide. So what are we going to be talking about today? So today is about sustaining the movement and the political work that we do. So to me, a big part of sustaining that work, you know, a lot of folks will say to you, it's about having all the resources, or it's about all the self-care, or all these things. To me, it's about being clear and defined around what it is you're actually trying to deliver. When you know what it is you're fighting for and you know who you're fighting for, it becomes a lot easier to make our movement sustainable. When we do this movement work and all we're doing is fighting for each and everything at all times, and we're just really becoming sacrifices, we no longer are a sustainable movement. We see far and far less successes, and we don't get to move very, very far. And so we're going to talk about a whole genre of things today about how we sustain our movement. And those things that I'm going to define are all about the fundamentals of organizing and the clear definitions you want to know as you're doing this organizing work, so that you can be very clear around what it is you're delivering and who you're delivering it for. If we want to go ahead and jump to the next slide. So like I said, we're going to do this introduction right now, and then we're going to do Organizer 101. You'll see the slide come up because there's lots of different parts of this program. And then we'll do the next slide. I know folks can't talk back to me on via audio, but you can in the chat. I would love for folks to share their name, their program, their title, you know, how long you've been a part of the ALF world, what brought you to ALF. So if folks want to just drop some of those messages in the chat, I would love to learn more about who's in the audience, you know, what brought you here, and I'll just give y'all a minute or two to send those answers in. And while folks are typing, I can just share a little bit about how I ended up at ALF many, many years ago. I think it was 2015, I was working at an organization with Amber Jones, who's now at ALF, called NOC, and we put together this table called the United Black Legislative Agenda. And I worked with Jeff Hassan, the ED, many EDs ago, and we put together a legislative agenda that we took to the Capitol. And we were actually able to build a large coalition, got the endorsement of the Star Tribune, the governor, were able to move tens of millions of dollars into Black and brown communities. And that was kind of the start of my relationship with ALF. And it's just been absolutely phenomenal to see all the ways that that folks have grown. I see all kinds of great folks in the chat. You know, we've got Ops Director for Conservation Minnesota and all the great work they do. The Josie Johnson Fellows. I have a super soft spot in my heart for Josie. She goes to my church and she's one of my first ladies. So I love that. I see we have brilliant consultants. Yes, this is a Team Josie household. Yes, I love my Urban League friends. I was in DC most of last week and spent a lot of time with Urban League National, so big fans. Wonderful. Well, it's great to hear about who y'all are and what you're up to and your relationships with ALF. Love to see all of that. Wonderful. And then I think we can jump into the next slide. So we are now going to talk about community agreements. You know, this, you know, will mostly be going back and forth via chat, but I do think some things that really, really matter is that we're in agreement of how we're going to talk and move throughout these spaces. And one thing I always like to remind folks is step up and step back. So step up and step back is this theory. There are folks like me, you know, chatty Cathy's. I have a lot to say. And so it's just reminding myself to step back sometimes and make space for other folks. Sometimes that, you know, that 20, 30 seconds of silence can really help someone who's been wanting to speak find their time. And obviously step up. If you tend to not really comment in chats and just kind of like, you know, stay offline, you know, consider sharing something. One mic, obviously, and then no bad questions. I want folks to feel really, really comfortable to just say like, hey, what does that word mean? Where's that philosophy coming from? What is that? What's the root of that? Or even just challenge. I really want folks to feel comfortable to ask questions, share their opinions, and be able to provide as much feedback as possible. Do folks feel like we're missing anything? Is there anything else that folks want me to be thinking about? All right. So let's jump into this conversation. And what I always like to start every organizer training with is really getting folks to think about why and how they get into this work. I think the number one thing that you can do in community organizing and to make it sustainable is to be very, very, very clear about the differences between self-interest and selflessness. And so I think about these two terms a lot in the political work that I do. Often you hear them, but you don't really can understand the difference between the two. Are there some folks who maybe want to share in the chat of like what you would define as having a self-interest versus being selflessness? And I think while folks are typing, we can hop to the next slide. So let's talk about that. So you see someone, I see a comment in the chat. You've got Amber saying being selfless means what I want doesn't matter, and I may not even know what I want. Great feedback. When I talk about self-interest and all of these terms, it's really about getting clear about who you are, who you serve, and why you serve it. So I think about some of these answers that I'm seeing. Self-interest to fancy means acting in ways that are primarily benefiting yourself. Selflessness means putting the needs and well-beings and interests of others before your own. Advancement of self and community. I'm seeing lots of really great answers. I can share kind of the ways that I think about it. We often taught, especially as Black folks, that we need to be selfless, that we need to sacrifice everything we have. The definition I have is that selflessness sounds noble, but it's a trap. The most powerful organizing happens when people act from self-interest, not pity, not guilt, and not charity. If it's not about you, you'll eventually burn out, walk away, or resent the people you're helping. And so let's talk about some of that. That might feel a little agitational at first. At first, you might be like, well, that doesn't make sense. And let me be clear. This is not saying that you shouldn't serve others. You absolutely should. You should absolutely be in partnership with your community. But it really is about being clear that you are not the sacrifice, that you are not going to give your all until you have nothing left. I think that's something that we often do in these spaces, and we have to be very clear about that. So getting into the definition of self-interest, we often are told and shamed into not having a self-interest. And so sometimes, your self-interest can be something that's not great. It could be something like, I want to have trillions and billions of dollars and hoard it for myself, which is not a great self-interest. But it's good to be clear about what your self-interest is when you're doing community work so that you know who you're serving and why you're serving. For me, self-interest it's caring because the issue affects you, your people, and your future. So if you know that you have a massive rally that you have to lead on Saturday, and you know that you have 15 reports due between now and then, selflessness would be to just keep, ramming through that work and getting it all done. Having a self-interest is identifying where you can find help in other people. Having a self-interest is understanding what you need to give up so that you can still be effective for the movement. And so it's a really important lesson that I think for all of us, is important for us to understand and to be able to really question and agitate ourselves around. Otherwise, we'll just end up burning out and giving until we have nothing else to give. All right, well then we will go ahead and jump into this next slide. So I always love to talk about this topic. I always think about community organizing, and folks kind of say what they define as community organizing. If folks want to say in the chat, what is your community organizing? How do you define it? What does it mean to you? Would love to have some folks kind of sharing some of that information in the chat. And as folks are sharing it, I always like to be very clear about what I define as community organizing. I think for a lot of us, the first time we ever heard that word was, for me at least, was Obama 08. When Obama was running, he called himself a community organizer. And I was like, what does that mean? Like in my head, I thought it meant like organizing papers, or I just had no clue what the term was. And I think, over the last 2 decades, it has really expanded. But for me, and the root of this conversation, it really is about this clear definition. It's about collective power, taking a strategic action and changing a system. So when we talk about collective power, I'm seeing some of the answers in the chat. It's about deeply relational organizing. So for many of us, we often confuse what collective power is. Sometimes it just means, for us, we'll just think, oh, I'm part of a coalition. That is not collective power. If you're not accountable to each other, if we're not getting buy-in from each other, taking strategic action. Sometimes we think it just means, oh, I signed a petition, but it's like, what action did that serve? What was the deep strategy around it? And we're going to get really into the definition of strategic action. And then changing the systems. Sometimes we're just doing things because it feels good. Sometimes it's just a performance that we're doing and we're not actually changing things. So when you're talking about community organizing, I always like to be very, very clear that it's about collective power, taking a strategic action, and changing a system. It's all three of those steps at the same time. I want to read some of these really great comments in the chat. So I see one from Fancy. For my work, I'd say bringing people together through art, culture, story, directing the collective energy into action, and using that to shift systems towards Black liberation, ownership, and sustainability. 150%. You can see in that she talks about the collective power of bringing people together. She talks about the collective energy into taking action. And she talks about the fight towards Black liberation and ownership, changing a system. And so really naming all three of those parts, and also owning that sometimes it's just collective power building where you're just doing one-to-ones, getting to know people. Sometimes it's not all three things at the same time. But knowing that all three of these parts are the keys to be able to actually do community organizing that isn't performative, and also ends up being sustainable long-term and actually ends up serving our communities. I think this comment from Faith, a collaborative group of people who are working towards a goal through friction and supporting each other along the way. We're going to talk a lot about friction, so appreciate that already coming up in the chat. If we want to click on the next slide. So when I talk about community organizing, I always like to remind folks what is not community organizing on its own. So people immediately think things like mobilizing. I'm going to bring 1,000 people to the Capitol on Tuesday. That is not inherently organizing. That is mobilizing. Now, when you add, we're going to collectively be bought in on this specific messaging. When 1,000 people get to the Capitol, we're going to contact our legislator or make a specific demand of the legislator. And then we're going to actually change a specific law. That is when you take mobilizing and you're actually implementing it into a community organizing strategy. The same is said with service. I think about the many times where I have done a service. I actually was just posting on my own social media about a friend of mine who just became a US citizen and is voting for the first time. That service I provided, helping with their immigration process, is not organizing. But that person, because of our relationship and the organizing I've done with them, is now taking a strategic action and asking me who they should vote for in our upcoming municipal election. So that is the organizing work. So like the service can funnel into organizing, but it's not organizing on its own. And obviously it's the same with advocacy. You can sign every petition you want, but if it's not tied into the rest of these practices, it isn't organizing. And one thing I always like to talk about is influencing. I think I cosplay as a social media influencer, and it's my favorite thing to pretend to be. And it's very easy to make cool content, have the prettiest graphics, have viral videos, but if they're not building collective power, taking an action and changing a system, it's not actually organizing, it's influencing. But let me just add, this is not, being these things is not a negative, you know, that is not the way that I'm thinking about it. I'm seeing it as these are pieces of this pipeline that leads to community organizing. And so I always like folks to think about that. So let's click the next slide. All right, so I have some examples here. Could folks in the chat kind of share, like, of these activities, which of these activities fits with the tactics inside of organizing? So if mobilizing, service, advocacy, influence are tactics, what is attending a protest? What is testifying at the Capitol? Like, how would y'all tie some of these activities with tactics? And I'll let y'all take a couple minutes to type up your answers. And so as folks are typing the answers, I'll share some of my own examples. You know, I think about in 2012, when I first got into organizing, I had never in my life had any interest in doing political work. Like I had, you know, door knocked for a governor or two and, you know, voted, but never really had taken it serious. And then in 2012, with the death of Trayvon Martin, I helped organize my first protest, and it dramatically changed my life. I actually ended up quitting my day job. I was a marketing major and accounting minor. I worked in healthcare. I had no plans on doing any of the things I do today. And I quit, and I ended up working at an organization for, I think, 8 years, and fully immersed myself in political work. But I didn't really know what organizing was. When I put that protest together, I just like threw it up. It was just a mobilizing event. It wasn't really connected to collective power, taking action, or changing a system. But somebody met me at that rally and agitated me and brought me into the movement and taught me all of these things and turned me into an organizer. So folks are talking about some of the things in the chat. We are talking about like attending a protest, being mobilizing, testifying at the Capitol is advocacy. Influencing could be, when I define influencing, Fancy, to respond to your comment in the chat, I think of influencing mostly social media influencing, digital currency, less of like political currency, but more of like the digital world, since it's become such a powerful piece of political work. But that's what I think of some of those tactics. Of how they're used. But paying bail is a great service that gets done in the ecosystem. And I think about organizations like Minnesota Freedom Fund, which pays thousands and thousands of dollars worth of bail. And now, if you may have heard, they've changed their model a little bit. So they went from paying bail to now the people whose bail they've been paying, they're actually organizing those folks to join their movement to help them end the cash bail process, to change the way the court systems work. And so they provide a service, you know, actually paying the bail, but now they're also doing the community organizing, building collective power, taking strategic action, and changing the system with their base. So now that we've talked about that, the definition of community organizing, we're going to talk about some other things you can do to sustain yourself while doing movement work. So defining some of this. Let's go ahead and click on this next slide. Power mapping. I know Amber already did a really robust training on this, so I'm just going to review it lightly and just talk about the ways that it can help you sustain yourself while doing movement work. The clearer you are defined about these terms, the clearer you can make decisions, and the more that you can sustain yourself while doing this work and being clear about your self-interest. So power mapping, it helps us understand who has power to give us what we want, identifying people who influence those power holders, and then strategic plans to shift the power to our side. So if we click on that next slide. So we have to think about 3 things when we're talking about power mapping. We want to talk about who our primary target is. So if I know that I want Target to re-administer DEI programming at their corporate locations, then I know that my primary target is the CEO and the board of directors. If I know that there has to be a secondary target, because I can't just call the CEO, and even if I do, he probably won't answer, who are secondary targets? Who are the people who are primary influencers? You know, thinking about donors, community members, faith leaders, the media. So we're seeing that campaign right now where folks are getting in the press. That's a secondary target. They are talking to shoppers, getting people to pivot the way they spend. And then you have allies. It's figuring out who is with you in this fight, probably like consumer protection groups and things like that, who can help and defend you. And then you get into opposition, the folks who are against you, and you have to understand them just as deeply as you understand your primary targets, because those are the folks who are going to do everything to get in your way and stop you from being able to reach those goals. And so understanding power mapping is essential to sustaining yourself in this movement work, because if you don't know who these 4 people are when you're working on a campaign, you will be wasting your time spinning and spinning your wheels, talking to the wrong people, organizing the wrong voices. We're going to get into part 2, the last half of this session, but I wanted to pause and see if folks had any questions as we get into this. Yeah, as we get into this. So the next portion of this that we're going to talk about, as folks share any questions they might have or anything like that, is about base building and coalitions. These 2 pieces are equally important when it comes to figuring out how you sustainably do community organizing. Often we go to this work and we just show up with a notebook and a pen and then a dream, which is great. But if we don't understand the infrastructure, the power that's available, the power that needs to be built, who we need to build it with, we often lose ourselves doing a lot of busy work, not fulfilling our self-interest, but really selflessly being human sacrifices to our movements. But I'll go to the next slide. And then we'll go to the next slide. So what is a base and what isn't a base? I think this is really, really important. I think one thing that I have been so impressed by ALF is that you guys are very, very clear who your base is and who you serve. You don't try to overextend yourself and be available to any and everybody that that might have an interest in y'all. You're very clear about, this is the African American Leadership Forum centering African American leadership, and you have done a deep investment in who those folks are. You've identified them. You're doing trainings like this. I think you often see organizations whose bases are wide and scattered, and anyone who wants to show up, which often aren't clear about who they're serving. And let me be clear, it's so helpful to be clear about who your base is. If you are available to any and everyone, regardless of values alignment, issue alignment, self-interest, you will burn out. But a base is a group of people who share your values, who trust you and each other, who take action when asked, who grow in leadership and commitment. So a base is not a fan base. So looking at that second part, it's not a bunch of followers. It's not a big email list. It's not a group that only shows up when you feed them pizza. It's people like the 15 folks on this call who in the middle of their day signed up and are watching and giving feedback. That is a base. That is the folks who are in a deep alignment with you, who share your values, who want to learn from you and be in community with you. We often confuse it. It's like we talked about earlier about tactics. Influence is a tactic, but influence doesn't inherently lead to a base. Sometimes it's just people liking things on social media. It's not folks who are growing in their commitment to leadership with you, which is a key part of all of this. Could folks in the chat maybe share some base orgs that they're a part of, or a base they identify with that is like important to them? Would love to hear about that. Amber just pointed out, building a base means sharing power. I can build power by myself as an individual and I can get so far, but I know that if I'm building it with multiple people and we're collectively tripling our power every time we add another member, I know I can accomplish far, far more. Are there any orgs that folks are a part of, that feels like a base that you're committed to, or a place where you're trying to grow and grow your leadership outside of maybe ALF and maybe other institutions? So I see Fancy talking about Soul of the Southside Crew. I don't know about them, so you got to put me on. I see Nell coming through with NJP. She shared that when she first started organizing last year, where I was meeting with someone who only wanted to talk about what was going on in their life and wouldn't show up to meetings and actions. So we're going to talk about that too. That's a big part of what it means to build a base and build a leader. Again, those are folks, they might be followers, or they only show up when there's something they specifically want, but it really isn't a shared alignment. And so really appreciate that feedback. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about the roadmap to a base. And let me be clear, this is definitely looks like it's pointing up, which is true because ownership is a lot more power and has a lot more accountability. But I actually believe sometimes this pipeline can go in different directions. So like I think about me, I showed up in 2012 and just said, I'm going to put together this huge rally. Never had done anything like that before, but I took on a leadership role. But the thing was, I didn't know much about organizing. I actually went all the way back to outreach and like had someone call me and actually do outreach with me. And then someone engaged me and had me starting to do engagement, meeting with other people. And then I started taking action, showing up at the Capitol, working on policy. And then from there, I was in a leadership role where I could actually be accountable to a set of folks. I was bought into a set of principles and values. And then I went to ownership, owning a set of work that I was in charge of and responsible for. And so don't think of this pipeline as just like straight linear. Lots of folks show up in different ways. I think a great example is I run an organization. I have ownership over this institution. I'm doing that work. But right now, I also do a lot of volunteer canvassing with Say Tool. I am at Say Tool, I'm on the outreach side. I'm at the very, very beginning. I'm just here to like be told what to do and where to knock and where to go. And so don't think of it as a straight linear activity. I think Nell talking about her example of the person who really didn't know their self-interest yet and really didn't know how to be a part of a base org, like that person might just stay at outreach forever. And then you have other folks who might just stay at action forever. They might just be someone who just likes to show up, do a set of actions and go home and not ever be fully tied into the whole pipeline. And it's okay to have those different type of folks. Not everyone has to be at the ownership level. It's just the highest responsibility and takes a lot of accountability. And so it's just like a much bigger circle in all of this. Do folks have any questions or any feedback or anything like that as we talk about what it means to build a base and why all of this matters? All right, I'll wait for y'all to jump in the chat if you do, and y'all want to click the next slide. So talking about base and all of this. So how do you find your base? Canvassing, school, church, mutual aid, friends of members. I always like to remind folks that base isn't just like going on the street and grabbing a clipboard like canvassing is. Sometimes it's just like someone you see, another parent at your kid's school. Sometimes it's at church. So, being open to who this person could be. Sometimes it's just someone who's already associated with your membership. But sometimes it's just like a random on the corner and always being open to finding, connecting with people and adding them to your base. And then, how do you keep your base engaged? The traditional tactics, your meetings, texts, roles. But the two I think that are the most important are joy and consistency. We are often so militant and disciplined, which is great, but sometimes we suck the joy out of this work that we do. And the joy is really the key here, because at the end of the day, when we talk about Black liberation, when we talk about freedom, we talk about justice, all these things, it's about your right to have joy. It's about your right to have happiness. That is really all we're searching for at the end of this. And so the big part of keeping your base involved is having joy and aiming for joy, not just always aiming to be angry, but how do you turn your anger into a righteous anger that can create some joy in people's lives? And a big part of being able to do that is also consistency, because when you're not consistent, people don't have a lot of joy. So just something to think about. And then we're going to talk about how you grow your leadership in your base, which is a one-to-one. So we are going to jump to that next slide. I'm gonna stop here and pause for a second and just kind of like recap some of the stuff we've talked about already, which is a lot. But we talked about the fundamentals of organizing, and we talked about that the fundamental definition of organizing is collective power, taking strategic action, and changing the system. So a big part of taking collective power is actually defining what those tactics are going to be that we do those collective powers, whether it's we're using influencing or advocacy or all of those things, or direct action. And then, taking strategic action is, you know, the next part of this, and then changing the system. So to even do all this stuff, to even do base work, to do any of this, it really starts on one-to-one level with people. When people hear the word one-to-one, they often just think it means like, oh, I'm just gonna go grab coffee with someone. Coffee is coffee. Coffee is a hang. A one-to-one is a very intentional conversation you are having with someone to get them to opt into the work that you're doing. It's a tool for building deep relationships that leads to collective action. Organizing is about relationships, and relationships are built one conversation at a time. You can build all the internet clout in the world. You can have a 10,000 person rally. If you can't get those folks to show up to a phone bank or to contact their legislator, you've done nothing but build clout. And so it's really about understanding the difference between clout and power. Those are two very different things. And the thing that actually helps make the difference between those two is those one-on-one conversations that you're having. If you want to click on the next slide. Awesome. So yeah, I would love for folks to just share in the chat, like, when was the last time you had a conversation that made you feel seen and moved you to action? Because that's what we're talking about when you have those one-to-one conversations. Usually in a one-to-one, what you're looking for is a deeper conversation. So would love to have someone in the chat share that. I'm actually just gonna go ahead and call on Amber, because I know Amber's been having a lot of one-to-ones. Very organizer led. So if you want to just share, you know, your last conversation that made you feel moved or seen into action. And then we'll, or sorry, digitally, if you want to share in the chat. If you want to go on the next slide. So what is included in a one-to-one? A lot of people, like I said, it's not just as simple as like, okay, I'm going to get coffee with this person. You want to do 3 things when you're in this one-to-one meeting. One, you want to be listening 70% of the time. Some folks say even up to 80% of the time, which means you're not spending the time in this conversation trying to tell them your whole life story. The majority of your time is spent listening to this person. You want to build a relationship with them. You want to identify their self-interest and what is bringing them to this work. And then lastly, you want to move them into action. You want them to say like, yes, I'm going to apply for the Josie R. Johnson Fellowship. Yes, I'm going to join your Zoom town hall. Like, yes, I'm going to join your committee. You are trying to move them from like kind of sort of interested into taking action. That's the difference between a one-to-one and coffee. So one-to-one is a very specific term in organizing. And again, this language feels like, you know, very rigorous and all of that, but it's on purpose because organizing has a very defined culture. And without understanding and defining this culture, it can become unsustainable and unwieldy. You know, you'll end up having 12 coffees in a week and you really haven't been able to convince anyone to take any action, or you didn't really build a relationship. You kind of just talked about your dog the whole time. That's not the goal here. The goal is, how do I do work in a sustainable way that actually leads to power building? I see Amber had posted in the chat a recent conversation I had with a friend of mine who's getting deeper into organizing, shared visions he had, the kind of leadership he was supposed to embody, and it was so powerful and sacred. That is what you're aiming for. You don't want to sit on a one-to-one and, you know, my dog, his name is Tarzan, he's laying down behind me. You don't want to hear me talk about Tarzan's vet bill for 15 minutes in our one-to-one. You want to hear me share what is my vision for my city. You know, what is my vision for my leadership? You want to hear me share what I can commit to doing in partnership with you. We're going to go ahead and jump on this next slide. So one-to-ones require an enormous amount of conversation and vulnerability, which can be very, very difficult. As someone who's an oversharer, I often deeply regret oversharing things about my life. And a lesson that I've had to learn a lot is the difference between public and private life. So I have a very public life with a lot of legislators. I also have a private life with a lot of legislators because they have now, after doing this work for so long, become people I love. Some of them have become family. And I have to have a deep understanding of when I'm having a public life and a private life. And this is so deeply important to understand. Sometimes those boundaries can get crossed, and inevitably they will, especially in a state like Minnesota, where we have such a tight knit and very active community. We have to have a deep, deep understanding of the difference between public and private life. You know, you are going to have situations where, I can give a very clear example. In 2016, I think it was, I had a very deep relationship, friendship. Well, not even a friendship. My sister worked for the governor of Minnesota, and I at the time was leading a direct action on the governor of Minnesota. So while my sister was in the back office, sitting in the room with the governor, trying to talk about what our demands were, all of that, I was outside of the chambers yelling and screaming with 100 folks making policy demands around public safety. And that was a really test of my public and private life. But I had to be very clear that, like, I'm in my public life right now. I have to lead this direct action, and I did it. And so it's for all of us to understand our public and private lives and being very clear about those boundaries and how and when we use them, and when we're deciding which one we're in. Pointing out one of the comments in the chat real quick. Fancy talks about having a 15 crew team for Soul of Southside with community organizers and producers. When they acknowledge my leadership without questioning it, I feel so seen. That is what a one-to-one will do to you. A one-to-one will make you say, like, wow, like, I can do this. Someone is actually asking me to participate. And that is like a really important part of this work, is like that demand, that calling that you get for yourself, and you can also give to others. Let's go ahead and click on the next slide. All right, so the thing that I am the worst at, but is also the most important, is data systems. Sorry. So the thing to always know is that tracking is key. So either you want a CRM, customer support software, or you want a spreadsheet. So for a very long time, I had a literal spreadsheet where every time I had a one-to-one with somebody, I would literally write down Jason Soul, professor, abolitionist, self-interest is this, that, and the other. Keeping that information really just helped me stay grounded in who I had been talking to, helping me pay attention to trends. Like, oh, I keep talking to folks that are from the East Side, or I've really been doubling down in these sets of relationships. But also 5 years later, when I'm looking for someone who might be a PhD in abolition, I know that I can call someone like Jason. And so those are some of the ways that data is super, super important. You can't just keep it all in your head. Like I said, the whole point of all of this is, how do you make this work sustainable and realistic? And we'll go ahead and click on the next slide. So the next thing that we're gonna talk about is about coalitions. When it comes to joining coalitions, they can become very unsustainable. They can end up sucking the life out of you, and you just end up in meeting after meeting after meeting. And so the way that I always like to talk to people about deciding to join a coalition and understanding whether it's worthy of your time is, just understanding the coalition is not just a group of orgs. If that's what it is, you should not be there. A coalition is a strategy to build collective and institutional power. If anything is taking you out of your organizing time, it needs to be about strategically building collective and institutional power. If it is not doing that, it is not worth your time. The way to build a strong coalition is to build it around trust, clarity, accountability. That is what equals a strong coalition. If you want to click this next slide. So the thing that I also want to make sure everyone leaves with, and you'll get access to these slides, is a coalition checklist. Every time you join a coalition, you want to join and ask these questions. What is our shared goal? What is my self-interest when I'm showing up? Who needs to be at the table that might be missing? What decisions need to be made? How do we treat each other? Who leads what part? What do we do together and what do we do separately? And then what roles do orgs play outside of the coalition? I think those last two we often forget a lot about, is that sometimes you got a big dog at the table with lots of power and resources, and they move a very specific way in coalition, and outside of coalition, they may have a policy agenda that's complete opposite of yours. Sometimes you have to accept that you're going to be in coalition spaces with folks you don't align with, or people who have far more power than you. And it's on you as a coalition partner to be thoughtful and prepared for those dynamics, and to also discuss how those dynamics will play out at your table. We'll click on the next slide. When it comes to doing coalition work, I always say start with written agreements and be honest about power. So you'll see on the left-hand side, that photo, that is a photo that is in the State House chambers. And it's a list of all the bills that the state ledge said that they were going to pass. What they ended up doing is that they started with written agreements. They physically wrote down a list, a beautiful doc that they printed off and checked off every time they passed a bill. And then they were honest about those bills. They were honest about what they were going to accomplish, what they couldn't accomplish. You see that it's not 50 pages long. I think it was like 15 items in total. So that's just like something to think about, is like always start with written agreements and be honest about power. And then I actually am going to have you go all the way to the last slide. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. There's lots more content, guys, and you'll actually get a copy of these slides. But as we wrap up, if folks want to share any other intel, I think there might be a couple more slides until the very end. Lots of good content for y'all to read on your own. There we go. We're almost there. I think it's slide 58. Lots of content, guys. So pretty much my 9 to 5 job is I do trainings 24/7, literally all day long. So there are lots and lots of trainings that I do repetitively. But what I want to close this out with, as we talk about how we do movement work sustainably, I think the thing that I always like to close out with is that organizing moves at the speed of trust. Conflict and harm happen, and ignoring them weakens our base. And I always like to close out with this specific comment for a specific reason. I think that when organizing work is not sustainable, so you're doing 20 one-to-ones a week and you can't keep up with the work, you're forgetting to text people back, and now you're having conflict, or you have taken on so much work, you're dropping the ball and it creates harm, and we end up losing a piece of legislation because you couldn't do it sustainably. All of that stuff has a long-term impact on you. It has an impact on your physical health, your mental health, your relationships, public and private. And so I always say to folks, to make this organizing work sustainable, you have to organize and move at the speed of trust. You have to do it with transparency and compassion. You have to do it in partnership with folks in community with you. You can't do it to a speed that burns you out or burns your community out. You're just going to end up doing it unsustainably, unsuccessfully, and just, at the end of the day, not being able to keep the work alive, which is not the goal. The end goal is joy, not the most things checked off your Asana board. But I will pause there and we can stop sharing the slides, and I will hand it back over to our MC and see if folks have any other questions in the chat.
That was amazing. I'm walking away with so many thoughts and things to noodle on. So thank you, Wintana. It looks like, let's see if there's anything in the chat. Oh, Nell said she needed to hear that last part. I think we all needed to hear that last part. So thank you all for coming and for being here. Before you leave, just a couple of things that I want to lift up. We have a couple of events coming up that we would love to have you a part of. If you go on our website, you can find registration information. On October 15th, we're having a mayoral forum for Minneapolis Future, which is a gathering grounded in care, rooted in Black wisdom, and reaching towards something greater. And so it's going to be a space where we move beyond the usual politics and really into shared vision, deep accountability, and community-centered leadership. So again, you can find registration information on our website. That's October 15th at 5 p.m. at the Capri Theater. The other thing I also want to share is we have a virtual panel on Detroit's Community Benefits Ordinance on October 24th at 11 a.m. Central Time called Policy as Power. And it's really a blueprint for activating policy as a tool for equity. And so again, you can find registration for that on our website as well. We'll be back next Thursday at 12 p.m. Central Time for our final session of the Movement Building for Black Futures series, which is Rest is a Weapon, Self-Care, and Collective Care as a Strategy for Change with Marley James. And Marley is the founder and CEO of Reviving Roots. And so if you haven't registered for that session, it's not too late. You can still register, share it with others. So bring a colleague, bring family, bring a question, but most importantly, bring your whole self. So you will receive an email after this with a survey. Please, please, please take just a couple minutes to fill it out. We really do use that information to really figure out what it is that our community is asking for. And so on behalf on the forum, thank you so much for being here and for building with us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.